close your eyes. Let your body grow heavy against whatever surface holds you now, and feel the weight of the day begin to lift. Slowly, the way mist rises from a still river in the early morning hours when the world has not yet remembered itself. Breathe in gently and breathe out, and allow your thoughts to loosen from whatever they have been gripping today, releasing them one by one into the quiet dark. You are safe here, you are warm here, and we are going to drift together, you and I, back through the decades, back through the soft corridors of history, to a time when medicine was still searching for its own reflection in the glass, when doctors believed with great sincerity that the deepest suffering of the human mind could be relieved by the careful, deliberate work of a surgeon's hand. This is not a story meant to alarm you. It is a story meant to carry you, slowly, the way a river carries a leaf, turning it gently in the current, asking nothing of it, moving it along. And if this voice helps you rest tonight, if these long, slow sentences settle over you like a warm and heavy blanket, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake enough to do so. For now, simply breathe and let the past come to you in the way that all old things come, quietly, without hurry, drifting in from a great distance. We begin in the early years of the 20th century, in a world that is just beginning to understand the geography of the human mind. It was the year 1874. In the small and quiet Portuguese town of Avança, situated along the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Atlantic wind moves slowly across the land, and the days pass with a kind of gentle, unhurried rhythm that the rest of the world has mostly forgotten how to hold. It was in this town, in this particular year, that a boy was born who would one day hold in his hands a silver instrument and believe, with absolute and sincere conviction, that he could reach into the brain of a suffering human being and draw out their pain the way one draws a splinter from beneath the skin. His name was Antonio Caetano de Abreu Freire Egas Moniz, and he would grow up to become a physician, a diplomat, a politician, and eventually the recipient of one of the most celebrated and one of the most controversial prizes in the history of medicine. He was a man of considerable intellectual gifts, a man who moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who has decided, very early in life, that the things he does not yet know are simply things he has not yet had the time to learn. He studied medicine at the University of Coimbra, one of the oldest universities in all of Europe, its stone corridors worn smooth by centuries of students moving through them with books under their arms, and questions forming in their minds like clouds gathering before rain. He completed his studies with distinction, and over the years that followed, he built a reputation as a neurologist of serious and careful method, someone who looked at the brain not as a mystery to be feared, but as a territory to be understood, mapped, and eventually, if the need arose, altered. He would publish widely on matters of the nervous system, and he would serve his country in roles, both medical and political, sitting in the Portuguese parliament, and even serving as Minister of Foreign Affairs during a period of significant political uncertainty in Europe. But it was not his political life that history would remember most clearly. It was a decision he made in the autumn of 1935, in a hospital in Lisbon, that would define him forever. And that decision would set in motion a chain of events stretching across oceans and decades, touching tens of thousands of lives before it finally, quietly, came to its end in a California hospital room in February of 1967. During the early decades of the 20th century, the state of psychiatric medicine was, by almost any measure, a difficult and deeply sorrowful one. The great asylums of Europe and North America were filling steadily with patients, men and women, and sometimes children, who suffered from conditions that medicine had named, but had not yet learned to treat with any reliable effectiveness. The names given to these conditions in that era were sometimes different from the names used today, but the suffering they described was recognizable and real. The profound disorientation of schizophrenia, the relentless darkness of severe depression, the ceaseless anxiety of what physicians of the day called psychoneurosis, conditions that robbed their sufferers of the ordinary pleasures of daily life and left them stranded in a kind of inner landscape from which no clear road home was visible. Doctors of the era had at their disposal a limited and imperfect set of tools, among them insulin shock therapy, which had been introduced in 1927 by the Austrian physician Manfred Sackel and involved inducing a hypoglycemic coma in the patient through controlled doses of insulin, and electroconvulsive therapy, which applied electrical current to the brain to induce a controlled seizure, and which had been developed in Italy by Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini in 1938. Though variations on the technique existed even earlier, these treatments worked for some patients, partially and imperfectly, and they offered a kind of hope that was real, even if it was incomplete. But the hospitals remained full, and the patients who did not respond to available treatments remained confined, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives, in wards that were crowded and underfunded and managed by staff who were, in many cases, doing the very best they could with the understanding they had. It was this landscape, this pressure of suffering and institutional need, that formed the background against which Egas Moniz began to consider whether surgery, the deliberate intervention of a blade or instrument into the soft tissue of the brain, might offer what pharmacology and psychology could not. The idea that surgery might relieve the symptoms of mental illness was not, in the mid-1930s, a new one. As far back as 1888, a Swiss psychiatrist named Gottlieb Burckhardt had performed a series of experimental brain operations on 6 patients at the Préfagie Asylum, attempting to relieve their symptoms by removing small sections of cortical tissue from the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. Burckhardt believed, with the earnest confidence of a man working at the very edge of knowledge, that the disruptive behaviors he observed in his patients were the product of excessive neural connections between different areas of the brain, and that by carefully removing certain sections of tissue, he might quiet those connections and bring his patients some measure of peace. The results of his experiments were deeply mixed, and the medical community of his day responded to his publications with something between skepticism and disapproval, and so Burckhardt's work was largely set aside, filed into the long, quiet archive of medical ideas that were perhaps ahead of their time, or perhaps simply wrong, and which would not be revisited for several decades. The idea lay dormant in the literature, gathering the quiet dust of an unexplored hypothesis, while medicine turned its attention to other questions. But ideas do not truly disappear from medicine. They simply wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until someone else arrives at a similar threshold and finds the courage or the conviction to step across it. Egas Moniz would eventually become that someone, though the path that led him to that threshold was a circuitous one, passing through a conference hall in London in 1935, where 2 American researchers named John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson presented their observations on the behavior of 2 chimpanzees named Becky and Lucy, who had undergone surgical removal of their frontal lobes, and who afterward displayed a remarkable and conspicuous reduction in the anxiety and frustration they had previously shown during experimental tasks. Moniz sat in the audience of that conference and felt something stir in him, a hypothesis, a possibility, the quiet and serious beginning of an idea. It was in November of 1935, specifically on the 12th day of that month, that Egas Moniz performed what is now generally regarded as the first modern surgical procedure undertaken specifically to treat mental illness. Working in collaboration with a neurosurgeon named Almeida Lima at the Hospital de Santa Marta in Lisbon, Portugal, a city where the late autumn lulls in long golden plains across the white facades of old buildings, and the trams move slowly through the narrow streets with a sound like a long, continuous sigh. The patient was a 63-year-old woman, suffering from what medical records of the day described as depression and anxiety of an intractable and severe nature, a woman who had spent years in the grip of a condition that had not yielded to any of the treatments previously offered to her. Moniz and Lima did not, in this first procedure, sever the frontal lobe connections in the way they would later refine. Instead, they injected absolute ethanol, a form of pure alcohol, directly into the white matter of the frontal lobes, with the intention of destroying nerve fibers there and thereby disrupting what Moniz believed to be the pathological circuits sustaining his patient's illness. The procedure was unusual, uncertain, and founded on a theory that was more intuitive than empirically established, but it was not performed without thought. Moniz had spent months in preparation, reading everything available about frontal lobe function, consulting with colleagues, and developing the theoretical framework he would publish in the years that followed. His theory, which he would come to call the theory of fixed ideas, proposed that mental illness was maintained by stable and self-reinforcing patterns of neural connection in the prefrontal cortex, and that disrupting those patterns through surgical intervention might allow the brain to establish new and healthier patterns in their place. It was a theory that contained within it a certain poetic logic, the idea that suffering is a habit and that habits can be broken, even the habits of the brain itself. Whether the theory was correct, whether it explained what was truly happening in the minds of his patients, was a question that medicine would spend the next 30 years attempting to answer. And the answer, when it finally arrived, would be far more complicated and far more sorrowful than Moniz had imagined on that quiet November afternoon in Lisbon. Over the following months, Moniz and Lima refined their approach, replacing the ethanol injections with a surgical instrument that Moniz designed himself, and which he called the leucotome, from the Greek words for white and cut, a slender metal rod tipped with a retractable wire loop that could be inserted into the brain through a small hole drilled in the skull and then rotated to sever the white matter fibers in a circular pattern. The instrument was precise by the standards of the day, and it gave Moniz a sense of control over the procedure that the ethanol injections had not provided. By the end of 1936, Moniz and Lima had performed the operation on 20 patients and had published their initial findings in a monograph titled Tentativa Operatoria no Tratamento de certas Psicosis, which translates as Attempted Surgical Therapy of Certain Psychoses, a careful and deliberately modest title that reflected Moniz's awareness that he was working in territory where certainty was not yet available. In that publication, Moniz reported that 7 of his 20 patients had recovered fully from their psychiatric symptoms, that 7 others had shown meaningful improvement, and that 6 had shown no change. He acknowledged the limitations of his follow-up data, and the need for further study, but he also expressed his conviction that the results were sufficiently encouraging to warrant continued research. The international medical community received these findings with a mixture of genuine interest and cautious skepticism, the way it receives most genuinely new ideas, examining them from a careful distance before deciding whether to approach more closely. Some neurologists and psychiatrists in Europe and North America began to attempt their own versions of the procedure, modifying the technique to suit their own instruments and their own patients. And slowly, over the months and years that followed, the practice of severing frontal lobe connections to relieve psychiatric symptoms began to spread outward from that small hospital in Lisbon toward the wider world, moving quietly at first. And then, when it reached the desk of a particular neurologist in Washington, D.C., with considerably more velocity. There are cities in the world where ideas accelerate, where the combination of resources, ambition, and a particular kind of institutional restlessness creates conditions in which a new method can travel farther and faster than it might in a quieter place. And Washington, D.C., in the mid-1930s was, in certain respects, such a city, a place where the federal government's engagement with public health and the presence of large psychiatric institutions created a climate in which new approaches to the treatment of mental illness were not merely welcomed, but actively sought. It was in this city that Walter Jackson Freeman II had made his professional home, arriving in 1924 to take up a position as the director of laboratories at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the United States. A sprawling campus of brick buildings where, in any given year, thousands of patients lived out their days under varying degrees of institutional care. Freeman was a man of extraordinary energy, a neurologist of wide reading and considerable ambition, someone for whom the boundary between enthusiasm and advocacy was frequently difficult to locate, and who believed, with a conviction that sustained him through decades of criticism and professional dispute, that the suffering he witnessed daily in the wards of St. Elizabeth's and institutions like it demanded more radical and more decisive intervention than psychiatry had so far been willing to provide. He was the grandson of the surgeon W. W. Keene, one of the first brain surgeons in the United States, and there was in his makeup a certain inherited confidence about the willingness to act, to place hands upon the brain and believe that intervention, however imperfect, was better than inaction in the face of suffering. When Freeman read Moniz's 1936 publication, he felt, by his own later account, a sense of recognition, the feeling that someone had at last acted upon an idea that had been waiting in the air, and he moved quickly to bring that idea to American soil. Freeman reached out to his colleague and friend James Watts, a neurosurgeon at George Washington University, and together the two men undertook the process of acting Moniz's leucotomy procedure for use in American patients, modifying the surgical technique and designing their own instruments suited to their preferred approach. Their first patient was a woman named Alice Hood Hammett, a 63-year-old housewife from Topeka, Kansas, who suffered from severe depression and anxiety that had persisted for years and had not responded to other treatments. On September 14, 1936, Freeman and Watts performed what they called a prefrontal lobotomy on Mrs. Hammett, drilling holes through the sides of her skull and using their modified instrument to sever the white matter connections in her frontal lobes, while she lay under local anesthesia in an operating theatre at George Washington University Hospital. By Freeman's account, written in the careful and measured language that surgeons use to record procedures in which they have a stake in the outcome. Mrs. Hammett tolerated the operation well, and in the days following the surgery, she appeared calmer, less consumed by the anxiety that had defined her recent years, more willing to engage with the ordinary activities of daily life. Whether this represented a genuine improvement, a relief of suffering that justified the intervention, or simply the behavioral flattening that would later come to be recognized as one of the procedure's most consistent and troubling effects, was a distinction that would not be clearly drawn for some time yet. Freeman and Watts were encouraged. Over the months that followed their first case, they continued to perform the procedure, refining their technique with each patient, adjusting the depth and direction of their incisions, developing a systematic approach that they would eventually publish in 1942 in a book titled Psychosurgery, a comprehensive account of their methods and outcomes that would become one of the central documents in the American lobotomy movement. By 1942, Freeman and Watts together had performed the procedure on approximately 200 patients, and Freeman reported in that year's publication that roughly 63% of their patients had shown improvement following the operation, that 23% had shown no meaningful change, and that 14% had experienced complications, including a small number of deaths. These figures, presented in the measured language of a surgical outcome study, carried within them a great weight of individual experience and individual loss that the numbers themselves could not fully contain. 63% representing hundreds of specific lives, in which the nature of a person's daily experience had shifted, sometimes for the better, sometimes in ways that were difficult to classify as either better or worse, and sometimes in ways that were quietly devastating, even when they did not meet the clinical threshold for being categorized as complications. Patients who survived the procedure and who showed the improvement that Freeman counted in his statistics often emerged from it with their most acute psychiatric symptoms reduced, but with other capacities diminished as well. A slowing of initiative, a reduction in emotional range, a difficulty sustaining attention, qualities that their families sometimes described with a kind of helpless sadness, as the patient being present in body, but somehow less fully present in the ways that made them themselves. The medical term that would later come to describe this constellation of changes was the post-lobotomy syndrome, and it was a syndrome that appeared with such consistency across patients and procedures that it eventually became impossible to attribute to individual variation or surgical error. It was rather a predictable consequence of the operation itself, a product of what happened when the connections between the frontal lobes and the deeper structures of the brain were severed, regardless of how carefully or how skillfully the severing was performed. But in 1942, this understanding was still forming, still gathering its evidence from clinical observation and patient follow-up, and Freeman and Watts continued their work with the belief that the benefits they were documenting outweighed the costs. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Portugal, Egas Moniz continued to work and to receive the recognition that his innovation had begun to generate within the international medical community. In 1939, while working in his office in Lisbon, Moniz was shot multiple times by a former patient who had undergone the leucotomy procedure, an act that left him seriously injured and partially paralyzed for the remainder of his life, and which stands as one of the deeply sorrowful ironies in the history of the procedure he had introduced. He survived the attack and continued his intellectual work from a wheelchair, writing and corresponding with colleagues around the world. And in 1949, he received what was, by that point, the highest possible recognition in the scientific world when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses, sharing the prize that year with Swiss physiologist Walter Rudolf Hess, who received his half of the award for separate work on the functional organization of the brain. The Nobel Committee's decision was not without controversy, even at the time, and the debate over whether the prize had been appropriately awarded to Moniz would continue for decades after his death, with calls from some quarters for the prize to be posthumously revoked. A gesture that the Nobel Foundation declined to make, noting that it does not review past decisions. Moniz would not live long enough to witness the full collapse of the procedure he had pioneered. He died on December 13, 1955, at the age of 81, in Lisbon, in the city where he had begun his work 20 years earlier, in the autumn light of a place that had known him first as a boy, and last as a very old man, whose contribution to medicine remained, even in his final years, a subject of intense debate. The procedure that bore his intellectual signature was, at the time of his death, already beginning its long decline, though the decline was not yet visible from where he stood, and he may have carried with him, to the end, the belief that what he had done had been, on balance, worth doing. In the years between Freeman and Watts's first American lobotomy in 1936 and the middle of the following decade, the procedure existed in a space between experimental and established, performed with increasing frequency, but still subject to the skepticism that new surgical techniques reliably attract from a medical community conditioned by experience to be cautious about dramatic innovations. It was during this period that Freeman began to develop a vision for the procedure that went beyond what he and Watts had been practicing in their surgical suite at George Washington University, a vision in which the lobotomy would be transformed from a complex operation requiring a neurosurgeon, a sterile operating theatre, and general or deep local anesthesia into something far simpler, far faster, and far more widely deployable across the crowded and under-resourced landscape of American psychiatric institutions. The impetus for this vision came partly from the scale of the problem Freeman was trying to address. The state psychiatric hospitals of the United States in the 1940s housed hundreds of thousands of patients, many of them in conditions of profound overcrowding and institutional neglect. And Freeman was genuinely troubled by this, genuinely motivated by the belief that if a treatment existed that could meaningfully reduce the burden of suffering in those wards, then the obligation of medicine was to deploy it as widely and as efficiently as possible. It was a vision not without compassion at its core, whatever judgments would later be made about the methods through which it was pursued, and it shaped the direction of Freeman's subsequent career in ways that would make his story one of the most complex and most troubling in the history of American medicine, a story in which sincerity and harm moved together down the same road, hand in hand, for more than 2 decades. The technique that would transform Freeman's practice and define his legacy arrived to him not from his own experiments, but from the work of an Italian physician named Amaro Fiamberti, who in the early 1940s had been exploring the possibility of accessing the frontal lobes of the brain, not through the skull, but through the thin bone of the eye socket, the orbital plate that separates the upper surface of the eye from the lower surface of the frontal lobe. Fiamberti's approach involved introducing a cannula through the upper conjunctival sac of the eye and injecting substances through the orbital bone into the frontal lobe, a method that was crude by later standards, but that demonstrated the orbital approach's feasibility, and that planted in Freeman's mind an idea that he would spend the better part of the mid-1940s developing into a refined and systematic procedure. Freeman adapted the approach, replacing Fiamberti's injection method with a mechanical instrument, a thin metal implement not unlike the ice picks used in that era to break blocks of ice for household refrigeration, which he called the orbitoclast, and which he would insert through the inner corner of the eye socket, past the thin orbital bone and into the white matter of the frontal lobe, sweeping it medially and laterally to sever the thalamofrontal fibers in a controlled arc. The procedure could be performed, Freeman believed and repeatedly demonstrated, in a matter of minutes, without a sterile operating theatre, without a neurosurgeon, and with the patient rendered unconscious not by general anesthesia, but by electroconvulsive shock applied immediately before the instrument was introduced. It was, in its conception, a procedure designed for scale, designed to be performed in the day rooms and examination rooms of state hospitals by psychiatrists who had never held a scalpel carried from institution to institution in a doctor's bag, like a tool rather than a surgery, like a key rather than a knife. On the 17th of January, 1946, in his office in Washington, D.C., Walter Freeman performed the first transorbital lobotomy in the United States on a 29-year-old woman named Sally Ellen Ionesco, who was suffering from severe depression that had not responded to other available treatments and who had, by the accounts available, consented to the procedure with the earnest hope that it might offer her some relief from the suffering she had endured. Freeman rendered her unconscious using an electroconvulsive shock device, introduced his ice pick through the upper eyelid of her left eye, tapped it past the orbital bone with a small medical mallet, swept it through the white matter of the frontal lobe, and repeated the process on the right side, completing the entire procedure in a matter of minutes. Mrs. Ionesco survived the procedure, and Freeman recorded her post-operative condition as improved, noting in his characteristic fashion that she seemed calmer, more tractable, less consumed by the anxiety and depression that had brought her to his office. He was jubilant, in the measured way that Freeman was jubilant, which is to say that he moved immediately forward, performing additional transorbital lobotomies in the days and weeks that followed, refining his technique with each case, and beginning, almost immediately, to communicate his new method to colleagues and institutions across the country. James Watts, Freeman's longtime partner and collaborator, watched these developments with increasing unease. Watts was a trained neurosurgeon, someone for whom the operating room and its protocols were not bureaucratic inconveniences, but essential safeguards, and the sight of Freeman performing brain surgery in an office, without sterile conditions, without a surgical team, using an instrument derived from a kitchen tool, filled him with a professional alarm that he did not attempt to conceal. Their disagreements over the transorbital procedure would grow over the following years, and by 1950 they had become irreconcilable, ending a partnership that had lasted 14 years, and that had, whatever its consequences, represented one of the most consequential medical collaborations in the history of American psychiatry. The period between 1946 and 1955 was, in retrospect, the high tide of the American lobotomy movement, the years during which the procedure was performed with the greatest frequency and the greatest confidence, during which Freeman traveled the country in a vehicle he called the Lobotomobile, a converted camper van equipped with his instruments and his electroconvulsive device, visiting state psychiatric hospitals in one state and then the next, performing transorbital lobotomies on patient after patient in rapid succession, sometimes dozens in a single day, and training the physicians of those institutions in the technique so that the work could continue after he departed. In 1949, the year that Moniz received the Nobel Prize, the number of lobotomies performed in the United States had risen to over 5,000 per year, a figure that represented an acceleration of almost incomprehensible speed from the handful of experimental cases performed by Freeman and Watts just over a decade earlier. The patients who received the procedure during this period came from many different backgrounds and carried many different diagnoses, schizophrenia being among the most common, but also depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive conditions, and in some cases, diagnoses that reflected not the patient's psychiatric suffering, but rather their inability or unwillingness to conform to the behavioral norms their institutions and families expected of them. Women were disproportionately represented among those who received the procedure, a disproportion that later historians and medical ethicists would examine at length, noting the ways in which the criteria for lobotomy in that era reflected not only psychiatric need, but also social definitions of manageable and unmanageable behavior, definitions that were inflected by gender, by class, by race, and by the institutional pressures of hospitals, struggling to manage populations too large for their resources. The most celebrated of Freeman's mass operations occurred in July of 1952 when he traveled to the state psychiatric institutions of West Virginia to conduct what journalists at the time named Operation Ice Pick, a 2-week intensive program during which Freeman performed 228 transorbital lobotomies in a period of 14 days, moving from institution to institution and patient to patient with a pace and a method that struck many observers as having more in common with an industrial process than with a surgical procedure. The newspapers of the day covered Operation Ice Pick with a range of responses, some reporting it as a heroic medical intervention, a doctor bringing relief to the forgotten populations of overcrowded state institutions, others expressing unease, though in many cases that unease was voiced quietly and at the margins, because the dominant framing in the media of that era remained broadly supportive of the procedure, and Freeman's charisma and confidence made him a compelling figure to those who covered his work. The patients themselves, the 228 men and women who received the transorbital lobotomy during those 2 weeks in West Virginia, left behind them a record that is fragmentary and incomplete, assembled in the years and decades that followed from institutional files, follow-up studies, and the accounts of family members who had observed the changes in their loved ones after the procedure. Some showed the reduction in acute psychiatric symptoms that Freeman consistently described as improvement. Some showed no meaningful change, and some showed the more troubling outcomes: the flattening of affect, the loss of initiative, the diminishment of the very qualities of self that their families had hoped to recover, that together composed the deeply sorrowful underside of the operation's legacy. It is worth pausing here, in the slow and unhurried way that this kind of history allows, to consider the medical understanding of the frontal lobes that existed in the mid-20th century, and to reflect on how that understanding shaped and constrained the interpretations that physicians like Freeman and Moniz were able to place on what they were observing in their patients. The frontal lobes of the human brain, which occupy the foremost region of the cerebral cortex and account for roughly 1/3 of the total cortical surface area, are now understood to be the primary seat of a set of cognitive and emotional capacities that neurologists group under the term executive function, a constellation of abilities that includes the planning of complex actions, the regulation of emotional responses, the flexible adaptation of behavior to changing circumstances, the maintenance of attention, the exercise of social judgment, and the experience of that quality, sometimes called the sense of self, the feeling of being a particular person with a particular history and a particular set of concerns. These capacities are not the only functions of the frontal lobes, and the relationship between frontal lobe architecture and specific behavioral and emotional functions is still, even today, an area of active investigation and ongoing revision. But by the mid-20th century, enough was known about frontal lobe function to raise serious questions about what was being lost in patients who underwent lobotomy, even when those patients showed the reductions in anxiety or psychotic symptoms that Freeman and others were reporting as success. The quieting of a patient's most disruptive behaviors, the reduction in the intensity of their psychiatric symptoms, was being achieved at a cost that the measurements of that era were not always designed to detect, a cost paid in the currency of initiative and agency, and the irreducible particularity of individual selfhood. Freeman was not entirely unaware of these costs, and the complexity of his awareness is part of what makes his story so difficult to place in simple moral categories. He acknowledged in his writings that many of his patients experienced personality changes following the procedure, that some became more passive, more easily managed, less capable of the kinds of sustained and purposeful activity that had previously characterized them. He described this passivity in some of his writings as a therapeutic outcome rather than a complication, arguing that the restless and driven quality that had characterized many of his patients before their operations was itself a symptom of their illness, and that the quieter, more tractable persons who emerged after surgery were not diminished versions of their former selves, but rather persons who had been freed from an internal tyranny that had prevented them from resting and finding peace. This argument was not entirely without medical reasoning behind it, but it was also an argument that could be applied so broadly, that could absorb so many different kinds of post-operative change under the category of therapeutic benefit, that it tended to function as a defense against precisely the kind of careful empirical scrutiny that the procedure required if its true effects were to be honestly evaluated. The patients who lost their capacity for sustained attention, for complex planning, for the warm and particular quality of emotional engagement with the people they loved, were being counted in Freeman's statistics as improvements, and the criteria by which improvement was being measured were criteria that Freeman himself had largely established in a framework that was oriented toward the concerns of institutions and families, managing behavioral disturbance, rather than toward the subjective experience of the patients themselves. Among the many thousands of patients who passed through Freeman's hands during the years of his most active practice, certain cases stand out in the historical record with particular vividness, not because they were the most medically significant, but because they have been documented in sufficient detail to serve as windows into the human reality of what the procedure meant for those who underwent it. Howard Dully was 12 years old on December 16th, 1960, when Walter Freeman performed a transorbital lobotomy on him. at Doctors General Hospital in San Jose, California, at the request of his stepmother, who had described the boy as defiant and difficult to manage. Dully was not psychotic. He was not suffering from the intractable psychiatric illness that the procedure had originally been designed to address. He was a child who had, by most accounts, a difficult and unhappy home life, and who responded to that difficulty with the ordinary resistance that unhappy children sometimes display. Freeman performed the operation, and Dully survived it and grew up, spending years in institutions and on the margins of ordinary life, before eventually finding, in middle age, the resources to investigate what had been done to him and to speak about it publicly in a radio documentary for National Public Radio in 2005 and in a memoir published the following year. His story, like those of many patients who received the procedure in its later years, is a deeply sorrowful one, not because it describes acute suffering in a clinical sense, but because it describes the long and quiet aftermath of something that was done to a person without their consent and without a medical justification that would withstand the scrutinies of subsequent generations. Freeman had, by that point in his career, performed lobotomies on 19 patients under the age of 18, including, records suggest, a child as young as 4 years old. And the willingness to extend the procedure to children represents perhaps the most difficult aspect of his legacy to hold in any frame that allows for understanding without judgment. The decline of the lobotomy as a widely practiced medical procedure did not come from a single dramatic reversal, from a moment at which the medical community looked at the evidence before it and made a collective decision to stop. It came instead in the gradual, layered way that medical practices tend to change, through the accumulation of critical evidence, through the arrival of alternative treatments that addressed the same conditions with fewer and less permanent consequences, through shifts in the broader cultural and institutional climate in which medicine operated, and through the slow erosion of the consensus that had allowed the procedure to expand so rapidly in the 1940s and early 1950s. The pivotal pharmaceutical development came in 1952, when the French Paul Charpentier synthesized a compound called chlorpromazine at the Rhone-Poulenc laboratories in Paris, a molecule that would prove to have remarkable properties in the management of psychotic symptoms, reducing the most acute manifestations of schizophrenia and other psychotic conditions without the permanent structural alteration of the brain. That lobotomy required. Chlorpromazine was introduced into clinical use in France in 1952 when psychiatrists Jean Delay and Pierre Denecker at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris began using it with psychotic patients and observed effects that were both consistent and remarkable in their specificity, a genuine quieting of psychotic symptoms that left the essential personality of the patient more intact than anything surgery had been able to offer. The compound was approved for use in the United States in 1954 under the trade name Thorazine, and over the course of the years that followed, as its use spread through American psychiatric institutions, the population of patients for whom lobotomy had been proposed as a reasonable option shrank steadily and significantly. The era of widespread hospital psychosurgery was ending, though it would not end immediately. And Freeman, characteristically, was not among those who accepted the end with quiet resignation. Freeman continued to perform transorbital lobotomies through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, moving his practice to California, where he set up an office in Sunnyvale and continued to travel to institutions throughout the state and beyond following up with his patients, performing new procedures, and defending the value of his life's work against the growing consensus that it had been, whatever its intentions, a deeply problematic chapter in medical history. The medical community was withdrawing its endorsement of the procedure with increasing clarity during these years. The neurosurgical establishment had never fully accepted it, and now the psychiatric establishment was moving away as well. As the pharmacological revolution gathered momentum, and as a new generation of researchers and clinicians began to articulate more clearly the ethical and empirical objections that had always existed at the margins of the lobotomy movement, Freeman watched these developments with a complicated mixture of resistance and sadness, continuing to believe, by the evidence of his writings and his conduct, that the work he had done over 3 decades had been genuinely beneficial for a meaningful portion of his patients, and that the profession's rejection of his methods was not entirely separable from its discomfort with the boldness and the unconventionality with which he had pursued them. In February of 1967, at Herrick Memorial Hospital in Berkeley, California, Freeman performed the procedure that would be the last of his career, operating on a woman named Helen Mortensen, who had been his patient for many years, and who was receiving her 3rd lobotomy from him, a fact that speaks to the complicated and prolonged nature of their medical relationship, and to the depth of the therapeutic hope that had kept both physician and patient returning to the same intervention over so many years. Helen Mortensen died from a cerebral hemorrhage following that final procedure, and Freeman was stripped of his hospital operating privileges and retired from medical practice, ending a career that had lasted more than 4 decades and that had touched, by the most careful estimates, the lives of approximately 2,500 patients in 23 states, each of them a person who had arrived at his door carrying a burden of suffering, and who had left carrying something different, something that could not always be named as relief, and could not always be named as loss, but that was, in every case, permanent. And so we have arrived, gently and without hurry, at a point in our long story where the foundational elements have been laid. The Portuguese physician whose idea traveled across oceans, the American neurologist whose conviction carried it into every corner of a nation, the patients whose lives became the medium through which those ideas were expressed and tested and ultimately judged. The soft candlelight of history illuminates these figures not as monsters or heroes, but as something more complicated and more human, as people living inside the limits of their understanding, carrying their certainties into circumstances that those certainties could not fully contain, and doing, in that space between knowledge and mystery, what people have always done, which is to act and to hope and to learn, sometimes too late, what the consequences of acting would turn out to be. The quiet scratch of a quill on paper in a Lisbon hospital in 1935, the distant sound of a small mallet against a metal handle in a Washington office in 1946, the soft turning of pages in a Berkeley medical file in 1967. These sounds belong to a chapter of medicine that has closed, and that the world has largely agreed to close, and yet they persist in the historical record with a kind of quiet insistence, asking to be heard, asking to be understood, asking to be carried forward into the present, not as a source of alarm, but as a reminder of how sincerely and how imperfectly the past has always tried to care for its suffering. You are breathing slowly now, and the past is settling into its rightful place, there behind you in the dark, as the present holds you gently, as sleep draws near. The year 1952 brought with it a particular kind of turning, the slow, nearly imperceptible pivot that large historical movements make before they begin their long descent, and it is worth dwelling in that year for a while, in the way that slow histories allow, letting the events of that single year rest in the mind the way a stone rests, in still water, settled and present, and heavy with implication. It was 1952 that gave the world chlorpromazines, synthesized in the autumn of the previous years by Paul Charpentier at the Rhone-Poulenc Research Laboratories outside Paris, a molecule that had been developed originally as an antihistamine and anesthetic adjunct, a compound intended to quiet the nervous system during surgical procedures, and that had, in the careful and observant hands of a naval surgeon named Henri Laborie, revealed properties that no one had specifically been seeking, but that everyone who encountered them recognized immediately as something entirely new. Laborie noted that patients who received chlorpromazine before surgery entered a state he described as artificial hibernation, a kind of serene detachment from their circumstances that differed from ordinary sedation in that they remained conscious and responsive, but appeared entirely unconcerned by their situation, calm in a way that was not the calm of sleepiness, but the calm of genuine disengagement from anxiety and fear. He communicated his observations to psychiatric colleagues, suggesting that a compound capable of producing such detachment in surgical patients might have applications in the management of the acute distress of psychiatric illness. And those colleagues, Jean Delay and Pierre Dennecker at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, began their own investigations in the spring of 1952, administering chlorpromazine to patients suffering from acute psychotic episodes, and recording the results in a series of papers that would become foundational documents in the history of psychopharmacology. The results they described were, by the standards of what psychiatry had previously been able to offer, remarkable. A genuine reduction in the positive symptoms of psychosis, the hallucinations and delusions, and the profound disorganization of thought, without the loss of consciousness, without the permanent structural alteration of the brain, and without the flattening of personality that lobotomy had been producing in patients across the world for the previous 15 years. The drug was not a cure in the sense that it required ongoing administration and that its benefits did not persist after it was discontinued. But it was a treatment, a real and consistent treatment. And the distinction between those two things, between cure and treatment, would prove to be less important to the history of psychiatry than the simple fact that something existed that worked, something that could be offered to the men and women in the crowded wards of psychiatric institutions without permanently altering the physical structure of their brains. Over the months and years that followed, chlorpromazine moved through the international psychiatric community with a speed that reflected the depth of the need it was addressing, entering clinical use in Canada in 1953, approved in the United States in 1954 under the name Thorazine by the Food and Drug Administration, and becoming, within a few years of its introduction, one of the most widely prescribed medications in the history of medicine, transforming psychiatric wards that had previously been managed largely through physical restraint and institutional containment into environments where conversation and gradual rehabilitation became, for the first time, genuinely possible for a meaningful proportion of patients. The arrival of Thorazine did not immediately end the practice of lobotomy, and Freeman continued to perform his procedures with the conviction of a man who believes the river of history is moving in his direction, even when the current has already turned. But the institutional and professional climate in which the lobotomy had flourished was changing beneath his feet in ways that could not be reversed, and the change was accelerating with each passing year. Meanwhile, in the research institutions and psychiatric departments of universities across the United States and Europe, a quieter but equally consequential transformation was beginning to take shape, one that would eventually provide the empirical foundation for the rejection of psychosurgery that the arrival of pharmacological treatment had made emotionally and practically possible. This was the movement towards systematic follow-up research on lobotomy patients, the careful and methodologically rigorous examination of what had actually happened to the people who had undergone the procedure, not in the weeks immediately following the operation, when the reduction in acute psychiatric symptoms was most visible and most easily documented, but in the months and years afterward, when the fuller picture of the procedure's consequences had had time to emerge. One of the most important of these studies was conducted by a British researcher named T.P.S. Omond, who in the early 1950s undertook a 10-year follow-up study of 150 patients who had received prefrontal lobotomies at a British psychiatric institution between 1948 and 1952, examining their outcomes at the time of the original study, and then returning to examine them again a decade later in 1962. The results of Omond's follow-up, published eventually in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, painted a picture of the procedure's long-term consequences that was considerably more complicated and more troubling than the short-term outcome, data that Freeman and others had been citing in defense of their work. Omond found that while a meaningful proportion of patients had shown initial improvement, the benefits for many had been partial, inconsistent, or difficult to sustain over the long term without additional institutional support, and that the personality and cognitive changes associated with the procedure persisted and in some cases deepened over the decade following the surgery. Patients who had appeared to show meaningful improvement at 1-year follow-up were, in some cases, considerably worse off at 10-year follow-up, not because their original psychiatric symptoms had returned, but because the cumulative effects of their altered frontal lobe function had compounded over time in ways that made independent living and social functioning increasingly difficult. The researchers also found, with a consistency that was difficult to attribute to chance, that patients who had undergone lobotomy showed a characteristic profile of intellectual and behavioral change that included reduced verbal fluency, impaired abstract reasoning, diminished capacity for planning and self-organization, and a flattening of the emotional responses that normally animate and enrich daily life. And that these changes, though sometimes described by families as making the patient easier to care for, were experienced by the patients themselves, when they were able to articulate their experience at all, as a kind of interior dimming, a loss of the vividness and urgency that had characterized their preoperative inner life, whether that inner life had been marked by suffering or not. These follow-up studies were accumulating quietly in the medical literature through the 1950s, building a body of evidence that the defenders of lobotomy could contest on individual methodological grounds, but could not entirely dismiss as a whole, and they were gradually in the way that scientific evidence gradually reshapes professional consensus, shifting the burden of proof from those who doubted the procedure's value to those who continued to assert it. There is a particular kind of institutional life that unfolds within the walls of the large state psychiatric hospitals of mid-20th century America a life that is slow and repetitive and conducted at a considerable distance from the movements of the outside world, and it is important to spend some time there, in those long corridors and those high-windowed day rooms, in order to understand the human context within which the lobotomy movement both flourished and declined. The state hospitals, sometimes called the back wards, sometimes simply called the institutions, were in many cases enormous establishments, housing thousands of patients on campuses that were, in some respects, self-contained communities, with their own farms, their own laundries, their own chapels, and their own rhythms of daily life that were governed not by the ordinary calendar of the outside world, but by the schedules and protocols of institutional management. Patients lived in these settings sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes for the entirety of their adult lives, separated from their families by the barriers of institutional policy, by poverty, by stigma, and by the genuine severity of the illnesses that had brought them there, and that, in the absence of effective treatment, kept them there. The men and women who received lobotomies in these settings were often among the most chronic and the most severely affected of this already isolated population, patients for whom every other available treatment had been tried without success, patients whose behaviors were the most disruptive and the most difficult for the institution to manage, and who were therefore the most likely to be considered for an intervention as radical as surgery. The accounts of life in these institutions, drawn from the memoirs and testimonies of survivors, from the records of advocacy organizations, and from the investigative journalism of the post-war period, describe environments that were often compassionately staffed and genuinely motivated by the desire to help, but that were also by the structural conditions of overcrowding and underfunding, unable to provide the kind of individualized care that genuine healing might have required. The lobotomy arrived in these settings not primarily as a treatment of last resort for a handful of carefully selected patients, but as a tool of institutional management, a method for reducing the behavioral complexity of a population too large for its caregivers to manage through other means. And this context, this institutional context, is inseparable from any honest account of why the Psychiatry was performed as often and as broadly as it was during the height of its use. The patients who were selected for lobotomy in state hospitals were selected not always because they were the most suffering, but because they were the most difficult. And the two categories, while they overlap considerably, are not identical, and the difference between them matters a great deal to any moral accounting of what was done in those years. The soft winter light that fell through the high windows of those day rooms in the afternoons, the distant sound of an institutional dinner bell, the particular quality of silence that characterizes a room full of people whose inner lives are inaccessible to one another, these are the sensory details that accompany the human reality of the lobotomy era. Details that no medical outcome study can capture, but that belong to the history as fully as any statistic. The cultural and literary world of the mid-20th century was not unaware of what was happening in the psychiatric institutions of its time, and the lobotomy and the broader practice of institutional psychiatry generated a body of artistic response that expressed, sometimes directly and sometimes obliquely, the unease that existed at the margins of the medical consensus. Tennessee Williams, the American playwright whose work was deeply shaped by his personal experience of mental illness in his family, wrote about psychiatric treatment with a characteristic mixture of compassion and dread, and his 1958 play Suddenly last summer centered explicitly on the threat of lobotomy, depicting a wealthy and powerful woman who attempts to arrange the procedure for her niece in order to suppress a testimony that would damage her family's reputation, a dramatization that made visible the connection between psychosurgery and the social control of unwanted speech that critics of the procedure had been articulating in the professional literature. The play was adapted into a film in 1959, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz and starring Katharine Hepburn and Elizabeth Taylor, and it brought the image of the lobotomy to a broad popular audience with a moral clarity that the professional debates of the medical journals could not achieve, framing the procedure not as a medical treatment, but as an instrument of silencing, and allowing audiences to feel in the visceral way that theatre and film allow feelings to occur. The particular terror of a surgery that does not kill, but that changes who you are. Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962 and later adapted into a celebrated film, used the lobotomy in its conclusion as the ultimate expression of institutional power over individual resistance, presenting the procedure performed on the novel's protagonist, Randall Patrick McMurphy, as the final and irreversible defeat of his defiant selfhood by a system determined to eliminate everything in him that could not be managed or contained. These artistic works were not, of course, medical documents, and their representations of psychiatric practice were shaped by dramatic and political concerns that inevitably simplified the complexity of what was actually happening in the clinical settings they depicted. But they were also not entirely inaccurate, and the cultural conversation they generated, the broad public engagement with questions about the relationship between psychiatric treatment and individual autonomy, contributed to the climate of scrutiny in which the professional reassessment of lobotomy was occurring during the same years. The quiet toll of a distant bell, the slow turning of pages in a library, the low murmur of a 1950s cinema audience absorbing images that the daylight world preferred not to examine too closely. These are the sounds of a culture beginning to reckon with something it had allowed to happen. And the reckoning was slow, as reckonings always are, but it was real, and it was accumulating. Walter Freeman, in the late 1950s, was a man in motion, literally and figuratively, traveling constantly, following up with patients he had operated on across the country, performing new procedures in the clinics and hospitals that still welcomed him, writing papers and delivering lectures in defense of his work, and maintaining the extraordinary personal energy that had characterized his entire career, an energy that seemed, to those who observed him, to exist in inverse proportion to the enthusiasm of the professional world for the work he was doing. He kept meticulous records of his patients, photographing them, corresponding with them and with their families over years and decades, tracking their outcomes in the kind of longitudinal detail that was, in its commitment to follow-up, actually more rigorous than the practice of many of his contemporaries, even if the interpretive framework he applied to what he observed was one that critics found difficult to accept. The picture that emerges from Freeman's own records, from the patient files and the follow-up letters and the photographs taken in the years after surgery, is a complicated and sometimes deeply sorrowful one. Images of patients who appear calmer, quieter, more settled than they had been before their operations, but who also appear diminished in some quality that the camera cannot quite name, a quality that is present in the eyes, and the posture, and the particular way that a person holds themselves in the world when they know who they are, and that is less present in the photographs taken after the ice pick had passed through the orbital bone and swept through the white matter of the frontal lobe. Freeman saw improvement in these photographs, and perhaps he was not entirely wrong, because improvement is a complicated word, a word whose meaning shifts depending on whose perspective it is measured from. And the perspective of the institution and the family, both of whom had to live with and manage the behavioral expressions of a person's psychiatric illness, was different from the perspective of the patient, who had to live within the mind that the surgery had made. He travelled in his van, the Lobotomobile, through the towns and cities of California and Nevada and Oregon and beyond, a figure at once driven and diminishing, a doctor who had once been celebrated and was now increasingly regarded as an embarrassment, someone whose methods belonged to a moment that medicine was leaving behind, and who could not or would not step aside to let that moment pass. The quality of his travel during these years, the long roads through the flat agricultural valleys of California, the institutional buildings appearing and receding in the rear window of his van, the particular loneliness of a person who has outlived the consensus that once sustained them, is something that the historical record captures only partially, in the tone of his letters and the frequency of his journeys. But it is worth holding in the imagination for a moment, quietly, before moving on. The patients who populate the historical record of the lobotomy era do so unevenly and incompletely, some of them known to us by name and by the detailed documentation of their cases. Others present only as entries in institutional registers, as numbers in outcome statistics, as brief notations in Freeman's travel logs, recording the dates and locations of their procedures. Among those whose stories have been documented in enough detail to allow something like a genuine portrait to emerge is Rosemary Kennedy, the third child of Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, born in 1918, and the older sister of the man who would become the 35th President of the United States. Rosemary had experienced developmental difficulties from birth, difficulties that, in the terminology of the contemporary era, would be characterized as intellectual disability, and she had been raised in the Kennedy family with a combination of protective love and the intense social pressure that the family's public prominence created, a pressure that manifested in the expectation that all of its members would present to the world a face of capability and accomplishment that left no room for visible vulnerability. By the autumn of 1941, when she was 23 years old, Rosemary's behavior had become, in the characterization of her father, Joseph Kennedy, unpredictable and difficult to manage, and Joseph Kennedy, acting without the knowledge or consent of his wife Rose, arranged for Freeman and Watts to perform a lobotomy on his daughter at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C., in November of that year. The procedure left Rosemary with severe and permanent disabilities far beyond anything she had experienced before the surgery, reducing her to a condition that required full-time institutional care, and that kept her largely hidden from public view for the rest of her life. The family acknowledging her existence only decades later, after her sister Eunice had begun the work that would eventually become the Special Olympics, a work whose origins in the experience of watching what had been done to Rosemary could not be entirely separated from its expression in advocacy for the rights and dignity of people with intellectual disabilities. Rosemary Kennedy lived until January 2005, when she died at the age of 86 in a care facility in Wisconsin, having spent 64 years of her life in the aftermath of a 20-minute surgical procedure ordered by her father without her knowledge or consent, a deeply sorrowful fact that sits quietly in the historical record and asks, without urgency, to be remembered. The relationship between the lobotomy and the social treatment of women in mid-20th century America is one of the most carefully examined dimensions of the procedure's history, and it is a dimension that deserves patient attention, the kind of slow and thorough attention that does justice to the complexity of what was happening, without reducing it to a simple narrative of victimization or conspiracy. Women were, in the statistical record of the lobotomy era, disproportionately represented among those who underwent the procedure, accounting, by most estimates, for somewhere between 60–70% of lobotomies performed in the United States, a proportion that exceeded their representation in the psychiatric inpatient population as a whole, and that therefore cannot be explained simply by the greater prevalence of psychiatric illness among women in that era, whatever the true distribution of illness may have been. Historians who have examined the case records and selection criteria used by Freeman and his contemporaries have found evidence that women were more frequently recommended for the procedure when their presenting complaints included behaviors that their families and physicians found socially disruptive, such as expressions of emotional distress, sexual behavior outside normative expectations, resistance to the domestic roles assigned to them by the social conventions of the post-war era, and what physicians described as excessive emotionality or hysterical presentation, categories that overlapped considerably with the ordinary range of responses that any person might display when living under conditions of significant stress or unhappiness. The criteria for lobotomy were not, in other words, applied in a social vacuum, and the gender of the patient was not irrelevant to the clinical judgments that determined who was recommended for the procedure and who was not, in the same way that class and race and institutional status influenced those judgments in ways that the medical framework of the day did not acknowledge, and that later historians have worked to recover and articulate. This is not to suggest that the women who received lobotomies during this era were all well rather than ill, or that their psychiatric suffering was not real, because it was real, and the conditions from which they suffered were genuine and sometimes severe. But it is to note that the decision to treat that suffering with an irreversible surgical procedure, rather than with other available interventions, was shaped by more than purely clinical reasoning, and that the cultural attitudes toward women's minds and women's behavior that pervaded mid-20th century American medicine were part of the context in which those decisions were made. The soft flicker of a clinical examination room light, the quiet scratch of a physician's pen moving across a referral form, the particular weight of a moment in which a judgment is being made about a person who may not fully understand what the judgment will mean for the rest of their life. These are the details that accompany the institutional history, that give it its human texture, that ask us to remain present with the complexity of what was happening, rather than retreating to a safe and distant position of retrospective condemnation. It is worth noting, as we move through the history of this procedure and the gradual accumulation of its consequences, that the lobotomy was not practiced identically across all the institutions and all the practitioners who took it up during the height of its use, and that the variation in practice was in some cases quite significant, reflecting differences in surgical technique, patient selection, institutional culture, and the individual judgment of the physicians involved. At some institutions, particularly the larger university-affiliated hospitals in urban centers, the selection criteria were more carefully defined The procedures more precisely executed by trained neurosurgeons in sterile operating theatres, and the follow-up more systematically conducted so that the outcomes, while still carrying the inherent limitations of the procedure's design, were somewhat better documented and somewhat less variable than those produced in the more improvised settings in which Freeman had chosen to operate. In other institutions, particularly the large state hospitals to which Freeman's travels took him, and in which the procedure was performed with the speed and the volume that institutional demand required, the conditions were considerably less controlled, the selection criteria less carefully applied, and the follow-up less thorough, with the result that the range of outcomes was wider and the adverse consequences more frequent and more severe. The Freeman transorbital procedure, performed in the way that Freeman performed it, without sterile conditions, without a neurosurgical team, with only the brief electroconvulsive anesthesias that rendered the patient unconscious for a matter of minutes, carried a mortality rate that was estimated in various studies at between 1 and 4%, meaning that of every 100 patients who underwent the procedure in his hands, or the hands of those he had trained, somewhere between 1 and 4 would not survive it. A rate that was, by the standards of the era, not wildly different from other surgical procedures of comparable complexity, but that nonetheless represents, when multiplied across the full scope of Freeman's practice, and the practices of those who followed his technique, a number of deaths that can be counted in the dozens, if not the hundreds. The variation in practice across the lobotomy era makes any single, unified assessment of the procedure's outcomes impossible, and historians of medicine have been careful to note this complexity, resisting the temptation to treat all lobotomies as equivalent and all outcomes as interchangeable, even while acknowledging the broad pattern that emerges from the totality of the evidence. A pattern in which the costs of the procedure, measured across the full range of outcomes and the full scope of the patient population, significantly and consistently exceeded the benefits that its proponents had claimed for it. The decade of the 1950s was also, in ways that extend beyond the specific history of psychosurgery, a period of significant change in the legal and ethical frameworks governing the practice of medicine in the United States and internationally. And these changes, though they were not directed specifically at the lobotomy, created conditions in which the questions of patient consent and physician accountability that the lobotomy raised were becoming more difficult to avoid. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in the aftermath of the trials of German physicians who had conducted medical experiments on prisoners during the Second World War, had articulated for the first time a clear and explicit international standard for the ethics of medical research, placing at its center the requirement for voluntary and informed consent from research subjects and the prohibition of experiments likely to cause death or disabling injury. The code was not, in its original framing, directly applicable to clinical treatment as distinct from formal research, but the principles it articulated were beginning to migrate into the broader discourse of medical ethics, raising questions about the conditions under which a physician was entitled to perform an irreversible intervention on a patient who might not fully understand its consequences, and whether the institutional pressures of hospitals and the social pressures of families constituted adequate substitutes for the genuinely free and informed consent of the patient themselves. Freeman had, throughout his career, operated in a framework in which the consent of the patient's family and the recommendation of the referring physician were generally considered sufficient authorization for the procedure, and in which the patient's own capacity to consent was often, by the nature of their psychiatric condition, in doubt. But the ethical questions this framework raised were becoming more pressing in the legal and professional climate of the post-war period, and they would eventually contribute to the regulatory and institutional changes that further curtailed the practice of psychosurgery in the decades that followed. The distant toll of a church bell across an open landscape, the slow passage of time in an institutional corridor, the gradual and almost imperceptible shifting of a legal and ethical climate that would eventually redefine the relationship between physician authority and patient autonomy. These are the slow processes of which history is largely made, and they are worth attending to with patience and care. By the early 1960s, the institutional landscape of American psychiatry was beginning to change in ways that would accelerate the decline of the lobotomy and transform the broader conditions of psychiatric care in ways that are still being worked through in the present day. The introduction of chlorpromazine and, following it, a growing family of antipsychotic and antidepressant medications had made it possible to manage many of the most acute psychiatric symptoms that had previously been managed through institutional confinement, and, at the extreme, through surgery. And this pharmacological shift was beginning to make the enormous state hospital system of mid-century America seem, to policymakers and to some reformers, like an outdated and unnecessarily expensive institution. In 1961, the sociologist Irving Goffman published his influential book Asylums, a detailed sociological study of life in a large psychiatric institution based on a year of fieldwork at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., the very institution where Freeman had served as director of laboratories at the beginning of his career. And Goffman's work described the psychiatric hospital not as a therapeutic environment, but as what he called a total institution, a place whose primary function was the management and social control of a deviant population, rather than the genuine treatment of illness, and whose practices, including the full range of somatic treatments from electroconvulsive therapy to lobotomy, served the needs of the institution at least as much as the needs of the patient. Goffman's analysis was not universally accepted, and it contained within it a degree of rhetorical overstatement that made it easier to dismiss than a purely empirical study might have been. But it articulated a critique that resonated broadly with a public that was, by the early 1960s, increasingly attentive to questions of civil rights and individual freedom, and it contributed to the intellectual climate in which the deinstitutionalization movement would take shape over the course of the following decade. President John F. Kennedy, whose family's experience with psychiatric illness and with the consequences of its treatment was, as we have noted, deeply personal, signed the Community Mental Health Act in October of 1963, a piece of legislation that provided federal funding for the establishment of community mental health centers, intended to provide care for psychiatric patients outside the institutional setting. And that represented the beginning of the large-scale deinstitutionalization that would dramatically reduce the population of state psychiatric hospitals over the following 2 decades, with consequences that were sometimes liberating and sometimes deeply complicated for the people whose lives it changed. In this shifting landscape, the lobotomy, which had been designed in part as a response to the managerial needs of exactly the kind of large institutional setting that was now being questioned and dismantled, was losing its rationale at the same time that it was losing its medical defenders, and the two processes together were creating the conditions for the quiet ending that would arrive, with the final procedure performed in a Berkeley hospital room in February of 1967. The story of the lobotomy's decline is also, in part, the story of the rise of a new generation of neuroscientists and psychiatrists who brought to their work both improved methods of investigating brain function and a more rigorous commitment to the kind of controlled empirical evaluation that the lobotomy movement had largely bypassed in its rush toward clinical application. The development of improved neuroimaging techniques in the post-war decades, including early pneumoencephalography and ventriculography, which allowed physicians to visualize the structure of the brain in living patients with greater precision than had previously been possible, was beginning to make it possible to observe directly some of the structural consequences of the lobotomy procedure, documenting the extent and location of the white matter damage in ways that correlated with the behavioral and cognitive changes observed in patients. And that provided a more precise anatomical account of what the surgery was actually doing to the brain. Animal research was also providing increasingly detailed information about the consequences of frontal lobe damage, with studies in non-human primates, demonstrating that experimental lesions in the frontal lobes produced the characteristic constellation of behavioral changes associated with the lobotomy syndrome, including reduced initiative, impaired planning, and altered social behavior, and providing an experimental foundation for the clinical observations that had been accumulating in the human literature for more than a decade. The field of neuropsychology was developing rigorous standardized assessments of cognitive function that allowed researchers to quantify the intellectual changes associated with frontal lobe damage in ways that were independent of the observer's prior expectations. And these assessments, applied systematically to lobotomy patients in the controlled studies of the early 1960s, were providing a level of empirical precision about the procedure's cognitive costs that the clinical impressions of Freeman and his contemporaries had not been able to offer. Each of these developments, taken individually, represented a modest increment of knowledge, but taken together, they were assembling a picture of the lobotomy's effects on the human brain that was both more detailed and more troubling than anything the advocates of the procedure had acknowledged. A picture that the med community could no longer avoid confronting, and that was contributing, day by quiet day, to the erosion of the professional consensus that had sustained the practice through its long and consequential decade of widespread use. The soft and deliberate pace of scientific revision, the way that knowledge moves through a field, not in dramatic reversals, but in the patient accumulation of findings that gradually make the old interpretation untenable, is itself a kind of lullaby, a slow and rhythmic process that asks for patience rather than alarm, and that carries within it, if one listens carefully, the sound of the future arriving in the present, one careful observation at a time. Walter Freeman performed what would prove to be the final lobotomy of his career in the first days of February 1967 at Herrick Memorial Hospital in Berkeley, California, a city where the January light is cool and pale, and the air carries the faint salt of the bay, a city that in 1967 was already becoming the center of a cultural moment that would reshape the American relationship to authority and to the human mind in ways that Freeman could not have anticipated when he first drove his Lobotomobile to California in the 1950s. The patient was Helen Mortensen, a woman who had been under Freeman's care for many years, and who was receiving, on this occasion, her third lobotomy, a fact that the historical record presents without commentary, but that carries within it an immense weight of history, the weight of a physician and a patient who had returned together to the same intervention 3 times, sustained by a therapeutic relationship that had outlasted the consensus that had once surrounded the procedure. And that continued, in its particular way, long after that consensus had dissolved. The procedure did not go as Freeman intended. Helen Mortensen developed a cerebral hemorrhage, a serious accumulation of blood within the brain, following the surgery, and she died of her injuries. Her death attributed directly to the complications of the transorbital procedure. The hospital's response was swift and unambiguous. Freeman's operating privileges were revoked. The formal institutional permission that had allowed him to perform procedures in a hospital setting was withdrawn, and he was, at 72 years of age, effectively retired from surgical practice by the decision of the institution in which he had been operating. He did not contest the revocation with the urgency of a man who believed himself wronged. He continued to travel, to follow up with patients, to correspond, to exist in the particular way that people exist, when the work that defined them is finished, and the world has moved on to other conversations. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage of his own on May 31st, 1972, in San Francisco, at the age of 76, a man who had performed approximately 2,500 procedures across a career of more than 30 years, and who had believed, by the evidence of everything he ever wrote or said, that the work he had done had been worth doing, that the suffering he had witnessed in the wards of St. Elizabeth's, and in the state hospitals of West Virginia, and the private clinics of California, was real and deserved a response, and that the response he had provided, imperfect and costly as it had turned out to be, was the best response available to him in the time and place and state of knowledge in which he had lived and worked. Whether that belief was a comfort to him in his final years is something the historical record does not tell us. And perhaps we do not need to know, because the question of what comfort was available to Freeman in the end is less important than the question of what comfort was or was not available to the patients whose brains he altered. And that question, the question of their experience, their interiority, the private quality of what it was like to be a person in the aftermath of the procedure, is one that history can only partially answer, and that deserves, in its partiality, our quietest and most sustained attention. The year 1967 did not announce itself as a turning point in the history of psychosurgery, because turning points rarely announce themselves, preferring instead to arrive quietly, in the manner of a season changing, the light shifting by imperceptible degrees, until one morning the world looks different, and you realize that the change has already happened, that it happened while you were attending to other things. While the days were passing in their ordinary way, and the world was moving, as it always moves, without waiting for permission. The revocation of Freeman's hospital privileges in February of that year did not produce immediate headlines or formal declarations from medical associations, did not generate the kind of public reckoning that the scale of the lobotomy program might have seemed to demand, but it did represent the closing of a door that had been open for 31 years, the quiet institutional acknowledgement that a particular chapter of medicine had reached its end, and that the time had come to file it away in the archive of things that had been tried and found, on balance, wanting. In the months and years that followed, the practice of transorbital lobotomy in the United States declined sharply and essentially irreversibly, the procedure disappearing from the repertoire of American psychiatry, with the same gradual, accumulating speed with which it had entered, carried away not by a single act of prohibition, but by the combined force of professional withdrawal, pharmacological alternatives, changing institutional landscapes, and the slow erosion of the consensus that had made it possible in the first place. The state hospitals that had once welcomed Freeman's visits were filling less rapidly than they had in the 1940s. The arrival of antipsychotic and antidepressant medications, having genuinely reduced the population of long-term psychiatric inpatients, and the deinstitutionalization movement that was gathering force in the late 1960s, was further reducing the institutional demand for the kind of behavioral management that the lobotomy had been designed to provide. The neurosurgical community, which had always maintained a professional distance from Freeman's transorbital technique and had regarded his willingness to perform brain surgery outside a sterile theatre as a violation of the most basic standards of surgical practice, was not mourning the procedure's departure, and the psychiatric community was increasingly occupied with the pharmacological revolution that was transforming its practice in more manageable and more reversible directions. The era of the lobotomy was over. Though the era of reckoning with the lobotomy, the era of understanding what it had meant and what it had cost and what it revealed about the nature of medicine and the nature of suffering was only beginning, and it would prove to be a longer and more complicated era than the one that preceded it. The process of understanding what the lobotomy had been and what it had done to the tens of thousands of people who received it unfolded over the decades that followed 1967 through several overlapping streams of inquiry, each of which illuminated a different dimension of the procedure's history and legacy, and each of which contributed to the gradually consolidating picture that medicine and society formed of what had happened during those 30 years. The first stream was the continuing scientific investigation of frontal lobe function, which accelerated rapidly in the 1970s and 1980s as new neuroimaging technologies made it possible to study the living brain in ways that had never before been available to researchers. The development of computed tomography, or CT scanning, in the early 1970s, and of magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, in the 1980s, allowed neuroscientists to observe the precise anatomy of the frontal lobes and their connections to other brain regions, with a clarity that transformed the understanding of what the lobotomy had been disrupting, making visible the elaborate network of pathways connecting the prefrontal cortex to the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the brainstem, pathways whose disruption, it was now possible to see, would necessarily affect not a single isolated circuit, but an entire ecology of neural communication upon which a wide range of cognitive and emotional functions depended. The second stream was the work of neuropsychologists and cognitive scientists, who were, during this same period, developing increasingly precise models of frontal lobe function, based on studies of patients with naturally occurring frontal lobe damage from strokes, tumors, and traumatic brain injuries. Models that confirmed and elaborated the picture of executive function that had been emerging from the lobotomy literature, and that made it possible to specify, with a precision that the earlier clinical literature had not been able to achieve, exactly what capacities were being lost when the frontal connections were severed. The third stream was the work of historians of medicine, bioethicists, disability rights scholars, and patient advocates who began, from the 1970s onward to examine the social and institutional history of the lobotomy with the tools of critical analysis, asking not only what had been done, but why it had been done, who had made the decisions, who had benefited from them, and whose interests had been subordinated or ignored in the process, and finding in the answers to these questions a set of structural patterns that extended far beyond the individual history of Freeman and Moniz. And that connected the lobotomy to broader questions about the relationship between medicine and social control, between psychiatric authority and patient autonomy, between the definition of illness and the exercise of power. In the 1970s, a new form of psychosurgery was being developed in research centers in the United States and Europe that bore a superficial resemblance to the lobotomy, in that it involved surgical intervention in the brain to alter psychiatric symptoms. But that differed from it in ways that were, from a scientific and ethical standpoint, fundamental and consequential. This was the practice of stereotactic surgery, which used precise three-dimensional coordinate systems to deliver very small and precisely targeted lesions to specific brain regions, rather than the broad and relatively imprecise sweeping destruction of white matter that the lobotomy had involved, and which was applied to a much narrower range of conditions, primarily severe and intractable obsessive-compulsive disorder and treatment-resistant depression in patients who had exhausted every other available option. The procedures developed in this era, including anterior cingulotomy, subcaudate tractotomy, and limbic leucotomy, were performed by neurosurgeons working in specialized centers under strict ethical oversight with carefully defined selection criteria, formal informed consent processes, and systematic follow-up protocols that bore little resemblance to the institutional conditions in which lobotomy had been deployed at scale in the 1940s and 1950s. The outcomes of these newer procedures, as documented in the peer-reviewed literature that accumulated over the following decades, suggested that for a carefully selected population of patients with severe and treatment-resistant conditions, the procedures could provide meaningful and lasting relief without the broad personality changes and cognitive costs associated with the lobotomy, a finding that was consistent with the greater anatomical precision of the newer techniques, and that pointed toward the possibility that the fundamental idea behind psychosurgery, that surgical modification of neural circuits could relieve certain forms of psychiatric suffering, was not inherently wrong, even if the methods through which it had first been pursued had been deeply problematic. The rehabilitation of psychosurgery as a legitimate, if narrowly applied and heavily regulated medical practice was a slow and cautious process, and it remained and remains today a subject of ongoing debate within both the medical community and the wider public conversation about psychiatric treatment. But it represents one dimension of the legacy of the lobotomy era, the dimension in which the original intuition of Egas Moniz, stripped of the institutional pressures and ethical failures through which it was first expressed, continued to be examined and refined by researchers committed to both scientific rigor and the genuine welfare of their patients. The histories of individual patients who underwent the lobotomy during its years of widespread practice are not uniformly sorrowful, and it would be a simplification of the historical record to present them as though they were, because simplification of any kind does a disservice to the complexity of what actually happened in those consulting rooms and surgical theatres, and institutional wards across 30 years, and thousands of individual cases. There are in the historical literature accounts of patients who reported, sometimes decades after their procedures, that the operation had provided them with relief from suffering so severe that the costs it imposed, real as those costs were, seemed to them to be an acceptable price. Accounts that deserve to be heard with the same seriousness as the accounts of those for whom the procedure was devastating, because both sets of accounts are true, and both belong to the history, and the history is large enough to hold them both without requiring either to be discounted or explained away. The complexity of the lobotomy's individual outcomes reflects, in part, the complexity of the psychiatric conditions it was attempting to treat, conditions that varied enormously in their nature and severity, and in part the variation in surgical technique and patient selection that characterized the procedure's deployment across dozens of institutions and hundreds of practitioners, and in part the simple and irreducible variability of human brains and human lives, which resist the neat categorization that outcome statistics impose on them. What the historical record does not support, and what no serious historian of the period has attempted to argue, is the proposition that the procedure as a whole, deployed at the scale and with the methods of the Freeman era, represented a net benefit to the patients who received it, measured by criteria that took seriously the full range of their cognitive, emotional, and social functioning before and after the surgery, and honored their own experience of what had been gained and what had been lost. The evidence for that conclusion, the conclusion that the costs were, across the population of patients as a whole, significantly greater than the benefits, is too consistent and too well documented to be contested by the accounts of individual cases in which the outcome was better than average. And it is that conclusion that the medical profession has, with the accumulated weight of decades of research and reflection, arrived at and largely held. The question of accountability for the lobotomy era is one that the history of medicines has handled with a characteristic mixture of acknowledgement and avoidance. And it is worth examining that mixture with the patient attention it deserves, because the way that a profession accounts for its past errors is as revealing as the errors themselves. And the lobotomy is one of the clearest, most well-documented cases in the history of modern medicine, in which a widely adopted intervention was later recognized to have been harmful on a significant scale. The professional response to the lobotomy's decline was not, in most cases, an explicit acknowledgement of error or harm, but rather a quiet withdrawal, a gradual disinclination to discuss the procedure in the terms in which it had been promoted, a tendency to treat it as a historical curiosity rather than a medical catastrophe, to file it under the category of things that were tried before we knew better, and to move on to the next chapter without spending too much time at the end of the previous one. The Nobel Prize Committee did not revoke Moniz's award, and the medical associations that had published Freeman's papers and invited him to deliver lectures did not issue formal statements of regret, and the institutions that had welcomed his visits and his procedures did not, for the most part, seek out the patients they had treated and offer them acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The patients themselves and their families were largely left to manage the consequences of the procedure, without institutional support or recognition, in the way that the patients and families are often left to manage the consequences of medical decisions that the institutions have moved on from, carrying in their daily lives the weight of a history that the history books were only slowly and incompletely beginning to tell. It was not until the late 1990s and the early 2000s that a more public and explicit reckoning began to take shape, driven in part by the accounts of survivors and their families, in part by the work of historians and journalists who had begun to investigate the lobotomy's history with the tools of archival research and oral history, and in part by a broader cultural movement toward acknowledgement of historical medical wrongs that was beginning to reshape the relationship between medicine and the communities it had harmed. The publication in 2005 of Howard Dully's autobiographical account, My Lobotomy, and the accompanying National Public Radio documentary in which Dully told the story of the procedure performed on him at the age of 12 by Walter Freeman at the request of his stepmother, represented a significant moment in the public reckoning with the lobotomy era because it brought to a wide audience not an abstract statistical account of the procedure's outcomes or a professional medical debate about its efficacy, but a single human story told in the first person by the person to whom it had happened, a story about what it meant to grow up in the shadow of something that had been done to you before you were old enough to understand or consent to it, and about the long process of finding your way back to a coherent sense of self after that. Dully's account was followed by others, by family members who described the changes they had observed in parents and siblings after the procedure, by researchers who had spent years combing through Freeman's meticulous patient files, and who were able to provide a detailed and systematic account of the outcomes across his full range of cases, and by bioethicists who placed the lobotomy within a broader history of non-consensual medical practice that included other chapters of medicine's engagement with vulnerable populations in ways that had prioritized institutional convenience or professional ambition over patient welfare. The accumulation of these accounts, appearing in books and documentaries and academic journals and radio programs, over the first decade of the 21st century, created something that had not previously existed in quite the same form, which was a substantial and sustained public record of what the lobotomy era had meant for the people who had lived through it, a record that complemented the medical and scientific literature, and that added to it the dimension of human experience that clinical outcome data cannot capture, the dimension of memory and grief and loss, and the complicated process of understanding something that was done to you and deciding what it means for who you are. The quiet scratch of a pen across paper, the slow turning of pages in an archive, the unhurried voice of someone telling a story they have carried for decades. These are the sounds of a reckoning that is still, in some sense, ongoing, still accumulating its materials, still deciding what it means and what it demands of those who inherit its consequences. By the early years of the 21st century, the lobotomy occupied a particular and somewhat complicated position in the collective memory of medicine and of the culture more broadly, remembered clearly enough to be referenced and discussed, but not always understood with the precision and the nuance that its actual history required, simplified in popular understanding into a kind of shorthand for the excesses of mid-century psychiatry, for the willingness of medicine to harm its most vulnerable patients in the name of treatment, and in that simplification, losing some of the genuine complexity of what had actually happened, the sincere intentions of some of its practitioners, the genuine suffering of the patients it had been designed to address, the real limitations of medical knowledge in the era during which it was developed, and the structural and institutional forces that had shaped its deployment in ways that went beyond the decisions of any individual physician. The history of the lobotomy is not a simple story of evil doctors performing harmful procedures on helpless patients, though harm was certainly done, and vulnerability was certainly exploited. And the patients who were most harmed had the least power to resist what was being done to them. It is rather a story about the conditions under which medicine makes decisions at the limits of its knowledge, about the relationship between therapeutic optimism and scientific rigor, about the ways in which the needs of institutions can shape and distort the practice of individual clinicians, even when those clinicians believe themselves to be acting in the interests of their patients, and about the long time it sometimes takes for the gap between belief and evidence to become visible enough to require correction. These are not lessons that belong only to the history of the lobotomy, because the same structural forces and the same cognitive tendencies that produced the lobotomy era have been present in other chapters of medical history and will continue to be present in chapters not yet written. And the value of attending carefully to this particular story lies not only in understanding what happened between 1935 and 1967, but in developing the habits of attention and the structures of accountability that might allow medicine to recognize more quickly and more clearly when it is moving in a direction from which it will later need to turn back. The brain itself, the 3-pound organ that the lobotomy treated as a mechanism to be adjusted, and that neuroscience has since revealed to be a system of almost incomprehensible complexity, is a fitting subject for a moment of quiet reflection as our history approaches its end, because the gap between what was known about the brain in 1935 and what is known about it today is itself a measure of how far medicine has traveled, and how much of what seemed like knowledge at the beginning of this story was actually the confident edge of ignorance, the place where understanding stopped and the unknown began, though the unknown did not always announce itself clearly enough to prevent those standing at its edge from stepping forward as though the ground beneath them were more solid than it was. The prefrontal cortex, whose connections the lobotomy severed, is now understood to be one of the most recently evolved and most distinctively human regions of the brain, the part of the neural architecture most closely associated with the capacities that most define the human experience, the ability to imagine a future and work toward it, to maintain relationships with other people through an understanding of their inner states, to hold a sense of continuous personal identity across time, to feel the full range of emotional responses to the world, and to modulate those responses in ways that allow for meaningful social life. The lobotomy, in severing the connections between this region and the rest of the brain, was not simply quieting an overactive symptom or calming a disrupted circuit. It was altering the very substrate of personhood, changing the material conditions upon which the experience of being a particular self in a particular world depended, and doing so permanently and irreversibly in tens of thousands of people who had come to medicines seeking relief from suffering, and who found, on the other side of the surgery, a kind of relief that was inseparable from a kind of loss that they could not always name, but that was nonetheless real and lasting. The neuroscience of the 21st century does not provide a simple verdict on the lobotomy, because neuroscience rarely provides simple verdicts. But it does provide a richer and more precise account of what was actually being done when the orbitoclast swept through the white matter of the frontal lobe. And that account, read alongside the clinical and historical record of the procedure's outcomes, makes it possible to understand, with a clarity that was not available to Freeman or Moniz, why the results were as they were, and why the costs were as high as they turned out to be. The legacy of the lobotomy extends into the present in ways that are not always immediately visible, but that are nonetheless real and consequential, shaping the ethical and regulatory frameworks within which modern medicine operates, informing the principles of bioethics that govern the conduct of medical research and clinical practice, and continuing to resonate in the lives of the patients and families whose histories intersect with those 30 years of widespread psychosurgical practice. The principles of informed consent, of patient autonomy, of the requirement that medical interventions be supported by rigorous evidence before being deployed at scale, all of which now form the foundational ethical infrastructure of modern medical practice, were strengthened and clarified in part by the reckoning with the lobotomy and with other mid-century medical practices that had prioritized institutional efficiency or scientific curiosity over the rights and welfare of individual patients. The National Research Act of 1974 and the Belmont Report of 1979, which established the framework for the ethical conduct of medical research in the United States and which remain foundational documents of research ethics to this day, were produced in a climate that had been shaped, among other things, by the growing awareness of how badly wrong medical practice could go when it operated without adequate ethical oversight, an awareness to which the history of the lobotomy had contributed its particular and weighty chapter. The development of institutional review boards, the formalization of informed consent procedures, the establishment of patient advocacy rights within medical institutions, the growing recognition of the importance of patient-reported outcomes as a measure of therapeutic success, alongside physician-assessed outcomes, all of these developments represent, in part, the slow institutional expression of lessons learned from the lobotomy era and from the other chapters of medical history that share its essential structure, the structure in which power and knowledge and vulnerability met in conditions that did not adequately protect those with the least of the first two from the decisions of those with the most. The history is not a comfortable one, and it should not be made comfortable, because the discomfort it produces is part of what gives it its value as a guide to the present, as a reminder that the confidence of the present is not immune to the same structural failures that produce the confidence of the past, and that the obligation of medicine is not only to treat suffering, but to remain perpetually honest about the limits of its ability to do so without causing harm. The story of the lobotomy is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the human desire to relieve suffering, a desire that is among the most generous and most necessary of the impulses that move human beings toward one another, that motivates the long years of training and the difficult work of clinical practice and the patient accumulation of scientific knowledge that together constitute the enterprise of medicine, and that is, for all of its generosity and necessity, capable of outrunning the knowledge and the accountability structures that are required to keep it aligned with the genuine welfare of the people. It is trying to help. Egas Moniz sat in a conference hall in London in 1935 and heard two American researchers describe the behavior of two chimpanzees whose frontal lobes had been removed. And he felt in that moment the particular excitement of someone who believes, "I found a key to a door that has been locked for a very long time." And the excitement was real, and the intention behind it was genuine. And it was not enough, because intention and excitement, however genuine, are not sufficient substitutes for the kind of rigorous, long-term, independently conducted ethically supervised evaluation that a permanent, irreversible intervention in the human brain required before it could be responsibly deployed at scale. Walter Freeman traveled the roads of the United States in his converted camper van and believed, with the deep and sustaining conviction of someone who has committed a life to a purpose, that the suffering in the state hospital wards was real and urgent, and that the tool in his bag could address it, and he was right about the suffering and wrong about the tool, or rather, he was partially right about the tool, in a way that was inseparable from his being deeply and consequentially wrong about it. And the partial rightness was enough to sustain him through decades of criticism without ever requiring him to confront the fuller accounting that the history eventually demanded. The patients who received the procedures, the tens of thousands of men and women and children who lay down on operating tables and in office chairs and in hospital day rooms and surrendered to the brief darkness of the electroconvulsive shock and woke up afterward into a world that was in some ways quieter and in some ways diminished. They are the center of the story, the reason the story matters, the reason we have traveled together through all these long and slow and carefully considered pages of history, and they deserve to rest now, as you deserve to rest, as the past deserves to settle into its rightful place in the long archive of human striving and human error and human learning. And so the history comes to rest, as all histories do, not in a conclusion that resolves everything, but in a place of sufficient understanding to allow the mind to loosen its grip on the details and let them drift slowly back into the past where they belong. The hospitals of Lisbon and Washington, the long roads of California, the crowded day rooms of West Virginia, the quiet faces in the follow-up photographs, all of it settling gently into the soft distance of a history that has been told and honored and can now be carried lightly, the way one carries knowledge that has been fully received, without urgency, without alarm, with only the quiet gratitude of someone who has spent time with something true. You have traveled a long way tonight, through decades and continents, and the corridors of institutions that no longer exist in the form they once held, and the traveling has been slow and careful and thorough. And now it is done, and the present is here, as it always is, steady and gentle and close. The room around you, soft with whatever darkness or light belongs to this hour. Your body resting in the warmth of wherever you are, your breath moving in and out with the easy rhythm of someone who has laid down the day and let it go. The past is behind you now, filed away in its rightful place, the ice picks and the institutions, and the long roads and the complicated men, all of it at rest, all of it quiet, belonging to history and not to this moment, which belongs only to you, and to the soft, unhurried dark, and to the slow approach of sleep.